Opening, the rain outside my office window was doing its best to wash the grime from the city, but it was fighting a losing battle, just like me most days. I was nursing a lukewarm cup of instant coffee, the kind that tasted like regret and old pennies, when the intercom buzzed. "The sister is here." My assistant's voice crackled through the speaker, devoid of emotion as always. "Send her in," I grunted, pushing a stack of overdue bills further down my desk. I like to keep a certain level of chaos. It kept the air in the room from getting too stale. The door swung open, revealing a woman who looked like she'd been carved from ice and then shattered. Her designer suit was impeccable, but her eyes, rimmed with purple shadows, held a frantic glint. This was Eleanor Vance, sister to the recently deceased tech mogul Julian Vance. The papers had called his death a tragic suicide. He clearly hadn't bought it. "User RF," he said, voice tight, a tremor just beneath the surface. She didn't offer a hand. Good. I wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. "Have a seat, Ms. Vance," I said, gesturing to the uncomfortable chair opposite my desk. It was designed to discourage long visits, a feature I appreciated. She sat, her posture rigid, clutching a designer handbag to her chest like a shield. "My brother did not kill himself," she stated, cutting straight to it. No preamble, no tears yet, just cold, hard conviction. I leaned back, steepled my fingers. The authorities seemed to think otherwise. High-profile case, thorough investigation, all the usual bells and whistles. "They're wrong," she insisted, her voice rising slightly. Julian was on top of the world. VanceTech was about to close a massive deal, a new AI integration that would revolutionize the market. He was ecstatic, full of plans. He wouldn't just end it all. "People at the top often feel the most pressure," I countered, playing devil's advocate. He thrived on pressure, and the note. It just wasn't him, the phrasing, the sentimentality. Julian was precise, almost clinical in his communication. This was flowery, sentimental, like something from a bad movie. I raised an eyebrow. "I think someone else wrote it. I think someone tried to write like him," she corrected, a flicker of anger in her eyes. "And they failed." And then there's the location. His penthouse. He loved that place, designed every inch of it. The idea of him desecrating it like that, it's unthinkable. He had a meticulousness bordering on obsession. Everything had its place. Even his contemplation, his moments of quiet, he'd usually retreat to the attic of ancestral home if he wanted to be truly alone, not his showcase penthouse. That was an interesting detail. The attic of ancestral home, a place for quiet reflection, not a final, desperate act. "And his rivals?" I prompted. "Anyone looking to take VanceTech down a peg?" "Everyone," she scoffed. "The tech world is a viper's nest. About corporate espionage, a mole within VanceTech." Julian was getting paranoid, pulling late nights, checking security logs himself. He even mentioned feeling watched just a few days before. Her voice trailed off, finally cracking. A single tear tracked a path down his cheek. "He trusted me, user RF. He told me things he told no one else. And I believe him. He wouldn't have left me like this." The raw grief in her voice was harder to dismiss than her theories. I saw the desperation, the need for answers beyond the neat package the authorities had offered. My cynicism was a thick hide, but sometimes a sliver of genuine pain could prick through. And frankly, the pay he was offering was enough to make anyone reconsider their stance on suicide. "All right," I said, pushing my coffee cup aside. "I'll take a look. No promises, just a look." A flicker of relief, so brief I almost missed it, crossed her face. "Thank I. Access to the penthouse has been restricted, but I have a key, and I've ensured his personal assistant is out of town for the week." "Convenient," I mumbled, already standing. "Let's go." Asterisk. The penthouse was a monument to minimalist luxury, all glass, polished chrome, and stark white surfaces. It smelled faintly of lemon polish and something vaguely metallic. Even in death, Julian Vance's meticulous nature clung to the air like a high-tech scent. The official story was that Julian Vance had taken his own life in his study, a room with floor-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering cityscape. The scene had been cleared, of course, but I had access to the crime scene photos. They showed a man slumped over a mahogany desk, a firearm clutched in his hand. Clean, straightforward, everything was immaculate. The large desk, now free of any visible stains, gleamed under the recessed lighting. A collection of rare, vintage fountain pens sat precisely aligned in a leather tray. A single, expensive-looking cigar humidor rested on a side table, its polished wood reflecting the city lights. My eyes drifted to an ashtray, a heavy crystal dish, sitting next to the humidor. It was empty, meticulously cleaned, too clean perhaps. I ran a gloved finger over the surface of the desk. No dust. The cleaning crew had been thorough. But then my gaze settled on the ashtray again, not the ashtray itself, but the small, almost imperceptible detail next to it. It wasn't dust. It was a fragment, a sliver of dried tobacco leaf, barely larger than a pinpoint. Julian Vance. According to Eleanor, smoked only the finest, light-colored Dominican cigars, a specific brand he had shipped directly. He had described them in detail, even the subtle aroma of cedar and cream they left behind. This fleck was different. It was out of place, a discordant note in this symphony of pristine luxury. I knelt, pulling out a small evidence kit. With tweezers, I carefully picked up the fragment and placed it in a tiny, sealed bag. Eleanor watched me. Her brow furrowed. "What is it?" she asked, her voice hushed. "Just a piece of a puzzle," I replied, my mind already racing. The official report wouldn't have mentioned a stray tobacco fragment. Why would they? They had their narrative. But this was a small, almost invisible sign of something else. Something that didn't fit. Julian Vance, the meticulous man, wouldn't have left such a thing, and he certainly wouldn't have smoked a cheap cigar. My initial reluctance began to melt away, replaced by the familiar stir of curiosity, the itch of a mystery. Eleanor Vance might be distraught, but her instincts, it seemed, weren't entirely off. This wasn't just a suicide. The cold air of the penthouse still clung to my suit, a subtle chill that no amount of brisk walking could entirely dislodge. Eleanor Vance had given me a list, a short roster of names, people who'd been closest to her brother, or at least professionally close. First up was Marcus Thorne, the chief operations executive at VanceTech. I'd seen his name pop up in the preliminary reports, always in the shadow of Julian Vance, but a significant shadow nonetheless. His office was a minimalist expanse of polished concrete and smoked glass, perched high above the city, a view Julian himself would have appreciated. Thorne, a man whose expensive suit seemed tailored to emphasize a certain lean aggression, rose from behind a desk that looked like a slab of dark, volcanic rock. His handshake was firm, almost aggressively so, and his eyes, though polite, held a calculating glint. "User RF," he answered, the name rolling off his tongue with a practiced ease. "Julian's sister mentioned you'd be making inquiries. A tragedy, truly. We're all still reeling." I settled into a chair that was surprisingly comfortable, designed, no doubt, to subtly disarm. "Indeed. I'm trying to understand the circumstances better. What was your working relationship with Julian like?" Thorne leaned back, his fingers steepled. Julian was a visionary, brilliant, but at times perhaps a little too focused on the grand gesture. I handled the day-to-day, the practicalities, kept the ship sailing while he charted new stars. There was a faint, almost imperceptible tightening around his jaw when he spoke of Julian's vision. It wasn't praise, it was a carefully packaged grievance. "Any recent disagreements?" I probed. He paused, a beat too long. "Every partnership has its moments of creative tension. Julian was pushing for a rather aggressive acquisition, a smaller firm, cutting-edge AI, but financially it was a risky bet. I voiced my concerns. Many of us did. He was, let's just say, uncharacteristically determined to see it through." "Uncharacteristically?" I pressed, meaning he usually listened to dissenting opinions. Thorne gave a short, humorless laugh. "Julian listened when it suited him. But this acquisition, Project Chimera he called it, was different. He saw something in it that the rest of us didn't quite grasp. Said it would redefine VanceTech, make us untouchable. I thought it would just make us over-leveraged." His gaze drifted out the window, a flicker of something, perhaps ambition, perhaps resentment, crossing his features. He had a way of getting what he wanted in the end, always. I noted the subtle implication. Until now, Thorne's ambition wasn't hidden under a bushel. It was displayed like a meticulously polished trophy. He saw Julian as an obstacle, a brilliant one perhaps, but an obstacle nonetheless. The acquisition, I realized, was likely the flashpoint for serious corporate tension, a pressure cooker Julian had been stirring. Next on my list was Dr. Evelyn Reed, head of VanceTech's Innovation Lab. Her office was a stark contrast to Thorne's austere corporate fortress. It was a controlled chaos of whiteboards covered in complex diagrams, scattered prototypes, and the hum of unseen machinery. Dr. Reed herself was a woman of precise movements and an equally precise intellect, him dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, his eyes sharp behind minimalist spectacles. User RF, he greeted, his voice calm, devoid of the theatrical sorrow Thorne had managed. Please sit. He gestured to a chair piled with schematics, which he swiftly cleared. Thank you, Dr. Reed. I'm trying to piece together Julian's final days. Your role here as head of innovation must have put you in close contact with him. Indeed, Julian and I collaborated extensively. He was a patron of pure research, a rare quality in a CEO. Her words were measured, each one carefully chosen. Mr. Thorne mentioned a high-stakes acquisition. Project Chimera, were you involved? Tangentially, she replied, her gaze steady. My team assessed the target company's technological viability. Their AI framework was revolutionary, yes, significant potential. And Julian's enthusiasm for it. He saw the bigger picture, the synergy. He believed it would accelerate our next generation of products by years, a bold move. She didn't offer an opinion, merely described his. The technology was sound. The financial implications were not my purview. Her posture remained rigid, her hands clasped on the desk. He was guarding something, or perhaps simply guarding herself. She wasn't giving me anything personal, just facts and figures, sanitized and scrubbed clean of any emotion. Julian Vance, the visionary, the patron, but never the man. I pressed on. Were there any concerns about the acquisition beyond the financial, internal politics, personal objections? VanceTech is a competitive environment, she responded, her voice flat. Innovation breeds ambition. Not everyone agreed on the strategic direction, but that's common in any large corporation. A perfectly crafted, perfectly unhelpful answer. It was like trying to catch smoke. Reed's clinical detachment gnawed at me. Both had motives, or at least opportunities for resentment to fester. The acquisition, Project Chimera, was clearly the pivot point, a source of significant stress and potential conflict. Julian, the visionary, pushing his will against a chorus of objections. Eleanor had mentioned something about Julian having a habit of keeping old family documents, even his childhood drawings, in the attic of ancestral home. A place he visited when he was thinking big, she'd said, a touch of fondness in her voice. It struck me then that while everyone at VanceTech spoke of the tech mogul, no one spoke of Julian. The man, the attic. It was a long shot, but sometimes the most revealing clues weren't the ones everyone was looking for. I pulled out my phone, typed in the address Eleanor had given me, and set the navigation. It was time to look beyond the corporate veneer. The city lights blurred into streaks as I left VanceTech, the polished chrome and glass of the building fading in my rearview mirror. Eleanor Vance's perfectly composed face still hovered in my mind. She'd given me nothing concrete, but her evasiveness had spoken volumes. People who had nothing to hide usually didn't try so hard to hide it. My next stop was less about corporate machinations and more about dusty echoes. Eleanor had called me an hour after I left VanceTech, her voice softer, less guarded. Julian kept some personal things, she'd said, away from the office. Things he didn't want anyone at VanceTech getting their hands on. At the ancestral home, the attic specifically, I can let I in. The ancestral home was a hulking Victorian, brooding under a bruised twilight sky. It was the kind of place that held secrets in its very foundations, not just its hidden corners. Eleanor met me at the grand, creaking front door, her expression tight. Most of it's just junk, she explained, gesturing vaguely up a wide, curving staircase. But Julian, he was particular about what he considered junk, said it was all historical data points. A wry twist of her lips. She handed me a heavy, ornate key. I'll be downstairs, don't break anything. I ascended, each step on the old wood groaning a complaint. The air grew heavier with each floor, the scent of dust and aged paper thickening. The attic door was a slab of dark oak, the key turning with a protesting groan. Inside, it was a cavern of forgotten things. Moonlight filtered through a grimy skylight, painting stripes across draped furniture, stacked boxes, and the skeletal remains of forgotten hobbies. Cobwebs hung like tattered lace, and the silence was profound, broken only by the scuttling of some unseen creature in the eaves. This was a far cry from the sterile, high-tech world Julian Vance had inhabited. I started methodically, moving from one stack of boxes to the next. Old-school projects, faded photo albums, tax documents from a decade ago. It was like sifting through the layers of a life, looking for the fault lines. My fingers, accustomed to the gritty reality of investigation, brushed away decades of dust. In a reinforced wooden crate marked simply JV Personal, I found it. Not a smoking gun, but a series of financial records, meticulously kept, separate from any VanceTech ledger. Tucked between a vintage comic book and a collection of first-edition sci-fi novels were several bank statements from an offshore account Julian had established. And among the outgoing transfers, a recurring, substantial sum, always to the same recipient, masked by a numbered account. It took me a few calls, leaning on an old contact in financial forensics, but the anonymous recipient eventually unspooled: Marcus Thorne. Julian wasn't just supporting Thorne. He was bailing him out repeatedly. The transfers correlated with known periods of Thorne's significant gambling losses, a habit I'd only vaguely heard whispers about. Julian wasn't just a benefactor, he was an enabler or perhaps a holder of a very long leash. The tension in my gut tightened. Thorne had a motive, a desperate one, if Julian had threatened to cut him off. I kept digging. Deeper in the same box, under a pile of old coding notebooks, I found a small, unmarked wooden box. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a single, slightly discolored photograph. It showed Dr. Evelyn Reed, younger, smiling, with two small children, a boy and a girl, perched on her knees. Tucked behind the photo was a birth certificate for each child, bearing a surname different from Reed's, and a recent bank transfer receipt. A truly staggering sum had moved from Julian's personal account to a trust fund established for these children. Dated just 2 weeks before his death, Reed had never mentioned a family, certainly not children. She presented herself as a singularly focused career woman. The payment was too large to be a bonus, too specific to be a simple gift. It reeked of obligation, or perhaps a profound secret that Julian had been keeping and paying for. My mind raced, connecting Julian's sudden suicide to a payout that could secure someone's future. The attic air, already thick, seemed to press down on me. I moved to another corner, a stack of boxes labeled Competitor Intel Pre-VanceTech. Julian had clearly been a paranoid man, even before his empire. Inside, amongst dozens of printouts of market analyses and patent filings from rival companies, I found a dossier. It was thick, heavily annotated in Julian's distinctive, aggressive scrawl, and focused entirely on a company called Apex Innovations. The notes were less about competition and more about outright sabotage. Apex moving to acquire Meridian Analytics disrupt their funding. Apex infiltrating our acquisition target, Solstice Systems plant disinformation. Julian had detailed Apex's tactics to derail VanceTech's strategic acquisitions, not just compete with them. And a recent memo, dated a month before Julian's death, outlined Apex's aggressive 11th hour attempts to scuttle VanceTech's latest, crucial acquisition deal. Julian had written, "This isn't just competition, this is war, they want us to bleed out." The pieces, disparate as they seemed, began to coalesce into a more disturbing picture. Thorne, indebted and potentially desperate. Reed, with a hidden family and a massive, recent payout from Julian. And Apex Innovations, a predatory rival actively working to dismantle VanceTech's future. None of this pointed to a man ready to end his own life. The stale coffee in my mug had long gone cold, just like the leads I'd been chasing. I'd spent the morning sifting through financial records for VanceTech, trying to make sense of the tangled web Julian Vance had left behind. The numbers blurred, the corporate jargon a dull hum in my brain. I decided to call it a day, needing a break from the screen glare and the scent of old paper. Stepping out of the elevator and onto my office floor, a prickle ran up my spine. The hallway was quiet, too quiet. My door, usually a solid slab of oak, was ajar, just a fraction but enough. I always locked it, even for a quick coffee run. My hand instinctively went to the small, weighted tool I kept in my jacket pocket. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning a protest. The sight inside hit me like a physical blow. My office, usually a bastion of organized chaos, was a wreck. Papers littered the floor like fallen snow, ripped and crumpled. My desk chair lay on its side, its wheels askew. The filing cabinet, a sturdy metal beast, had been pried open, its contents strewn everywhere. My computer monitor lay face down, a spiderweb crack marring its surface. Anger, cold and sharp, cut through my initial shock. This wasn't a random smash and grab. This was targeted. They hadn't taken anything of obvious value, the old radio, the framed newspaper clippings, the spare change jar, but they'd certainly made a mess. They were looking for something specific. I walked through the debris, my boots crunching on scattered reports and broken pen casings. My eyes scanned the room, searching for what might have been the target. My case files on Julian Vance were scattered, but most of them were still there, albeit in disarray. The hard drive I used for backups, usually hidden behind a stack of reference books, was gone. That was it. They weren't looking for my files, they were looking for Julian's files or any digital copies I might have made. I pulled out my phone and called the local precinct officer I occasionally worked with, a gruff but competent woman. I kept the details vague, reporting a break-in and vandalism, but omitting the specifics of the Vance case. No need to muddy the waters with official channels just yet. This was personal now. As I waited for the officer to arrive, a thought nagged at me. Why the hard drive? What had I copied that was so important? My mind replayed the last few days. Reed's suspiciously large payout, Thorne's financial woes, Apex Innovations circling VanceTech like a vulture. I hadn't found a smoking gun, not yet, but I had a lot of disparate data, and someone clearly didn't want me to connect the dots. The officer arrived, took her notes, and offered her sympathies. I nodded, feigning appropriate distress, but my mind was already elsewhere. If they were looking for digital files, it meant Julian had something important hidden digitally, something I hadn't found yet. I remembered Eleanor Vance mentioning, almost as an aside, how Julian as a child used to retreat to the attic of ancestral home whenever he wanted to work on his secret projects. He'd built elaborate forts up there, tinkered with old electronics, a place he considered safe, secure, away from prying eyes. It was a long shot, but it was a shot. I left the officer to her paperwork and headed straight for the Vance ancestral home. The old manor stood imposing and silent against the afternoon sky, a testament to generations of wealth and secrets. Eleanor had given me a spare key for general access, but I doubted she'd ever imagined I'd be rummaging through dusty heirlooms in the attic. The grand staircase groaned under my weight, each step echoing in the cavernous halls. I bypassed the ornate living rooms and formal dining areas, my destination the narrow, winding servant stairs that led to the upper floors. Finally, a heavy, unadorned door, the attic. I pushed it open, and a wave of musty air, thick with the scent of aged wood and forgotten things, washed over me. The space was vast and dimly lit by a single bare bulb hanging from the rafters. Tarps covered lumpy shapes, old furniture, no doubt. Stacks of yellowed boxes lined the walls, filled with faded memories. I started my search methodically, sweeping my gaze across the floor, running my hands along the rough-hewn beams. Julian was a tech mogul, not a sentimentalist. He wouldn't hide something important in a velvet-lined box of old letters. He'd hide it in plain sight, or in a way that only he would think of. My eyes landed on an old, heavy wooden chest near a dormer window. It looked like a sea captain's trunk, reinforced with iron bands. It was out of place amongst the more delicate Victorian-era pieces. I ran my hand over its rough surface, feeling for anything unusual. Nothing. Then I noticed it. A slight discoloration in the wood paneling behind the trunk, just above the floorboard, too regular to be natural aging. I knelt, pushing aside the trunk, and ran my fingers along the seam. It was almost invisible, meticulously crafted. A false panel. With a grunt, I managed to pry it open. Inside, nestled in a custom-fitted compartment lined with acoustic foam, sat a small black server. No blinking lights, no obvious ports. Just a sleek, silent brick of technology. Julian Vance, you clever bastard. I carefully extracted the server, noting its surprising weight. Back in my temporary, less vandalized workspace, a friend's unused garage, I set about the task of cracking it open. Julian had been a genius, and his security protocols reflected that. Hours blurred into a haze of code, algorithms, and brute force attempts. My fingers flew across the keyboard, fueled by stale coffee and a growing sense of urgency. Then a green line of text flashed across the screen, access granted. My breath hitched, I was in. The directory structure was clean, organized. I navigated to a folder labeled Project Nightingale. Inside were hundreds of files, most encrypted, but a few were immediately accessible. My eyes scanned the file names. Apex Innovations Acquisition Strategy Internal Draft, VanceTech Q3 Performance Projections, Pre-Apex Deal, and then, more disturbingly, Unauthorized Data Access Log 20XX Roman 20 Roman 20. I opened the log first. It detailed multiple attempts to access VanceTech's core intellectual property database, specifically targeting the data related to their upcoming AI project, Viridian. The attempts weren't external, not entirely. The IP addresses were internal, originating from within the VanceTech network, someone on the inside. Then I opened the Apex Innovations files. They contained highly sensitive information about VanceTech's vulnerabilities, their financial forecasts, even detailed profiles of key personnel. Information that Apex Innovations would kill for, information that Julian Vance would never willingly share. My gaze fell on a specific document, Viridian Project Phase 3 Data Compromise Report. The report outlined a systematic leak of critical data to an external entity, timed perfectly with Apex Innovations' aggressive moves against VanceTech. The date of the compromise, just weeks before Julian Vance's alleged suicide. The pieces, disparate as they seemed, began to coalesce into a more disturbing picture. None of it pointed to suicide. Julian Vance wasn't just murdered, he was betrayed. And the killer was hiding in plain sight, closer than I ever imagined. The break-in at my office wasn't a warning, it was confirmation. I was on the right track and someone knew it. The screen of my ancient laptop flickered, a green progress bar inching its way across a black field. I'd been at it for hours, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a stubborn hunch. The internal IP addresses from the previous chapter, the ones tied to the Viridian project, had been a significant lead. Julian Vance's security logs, meticulously maintained, had been a Gordian knot of encryption, but I was finally untangling it. A high-pitched whine from the laptop's fan told me it was working overtime. Sweat beaded on my forehead, not from heat, but from the pressure of knowing this was it. This was the key. If I was right, this would blow the suicide theory to smithereens. The last segment of the decryption algorithm finally clicked into place, heralded by a soft ding from the speakers. The screen flooded with data. It was all there. A detailed log of data transfers, not just attempts, but successful exfiltrations of the Viridian project's core algorithms and predictive models. The timestamp on the last successful transfer, mere hours before Julian Vance's body was found. And the source IP, the one originating from within VanceTech's network, was resolved to a specific user account. A name stared back at me, stark and undeniable. Marcus Thorne, Julian's right-hand man, the devoted colleague, the grieving friend, the mole. My jaw tightened. Thorne, it made a sickening kind of sense. He had access to everything, the trust of the CEO, and the perfect position to siphon off intellectual property without raising immediate suspicion. The internal IP addresses, the targeted data, the timing, it all coalesced into a damning picture. I printed out the crucial logs, the user ID, the timestamp, and a summary of the stolen data. The paper felt heavy, like a death warrant. Now, for the confrontation, I couldn't just corner him at VanceTech. He'd likely bolt or delete any lingering evidence. I needed an isolated, controlled environment. And then it hit me. Eleanor Vance had mentioned her ancestral home, a sprawling, old place Julian had sometimes retreated to. It was perfect. A place with history. A place where Julian might have left something behind, a lure Thorne couldn't resist. I made the call, my voice carefully modulated. Thorne, I began, I've been digging through some of Julian's old personal effects at the ancestral home. He was found something peculiar in the attic. Something that suggests a rival company was targeting VanceTech, even Julian himself. Thought I'd want to see it. Could shed light on the suicide ruling, perhaps clear Julian's name. His voice on the other end was too eager, a little too strained in its casualness. The attic, at the old place, I suppose I could swing by when, give me an hour, I added. I need to sort through a few more things up here first. An hour later, I was waiting in the attic of the ancestral home. The air was thick with the scent of dust and forgotten things. Sunlight, fractured by grimy panes, cut through the gloom, illuminating dancing motes. Old, sheet-draped furniture loomed like silent sentinels. A single bare bulb hung from a frayed cord, casting a harsh yellow glow on the wooden floorboards where I stood. I clutched the printouts, the evidence, like a shield. Footsteps creaked on the stairs below, ascending slowly. Each step was amplified in the oppressive silence. The attic door, a heavy oak slab, groaned open. Thorne stood framed in the doorway, a nervous smile plastered on his face. He wore a sharp suit, but his tie was slightly askew, and his eyes darted around the cluttered space, not meeting mine. "User RF," he answered, his voice a little breathy. "What exactly did I find up here? I thought Julian kept everything important at the penthouse or the office." "He did," I replied, my voice steady, betraying none of the tension coiling in my gut. "But some things, some truths, they have a way of finding their way out no matter where they are hidden." I gestured to a dusty, overturned crate. "Have a seat, Thorne, we have a lot to discuss." He hesitated, then reluctantly perched on the crate, his gaze still avoiding mine. "So this rival company, what did I find?" I took a step closer, holding up the stack of papers. "I found this, Thorne, not in Julian's old boxes up here, but in his digital archives. What I told I on the phone was a lie, a necessary one to get I here. And what I found isn't about some rival company targeting VanceTech. It's about a mole inside VanceTech." His face paled, the nervous smile vanishing. "A mole? What are I talking about?" "I'm talking about the Viridian project data," I stated, my voice cutting through the quiet. "Specifically the exfiltration logs, the internal IP addresses, the user account tied to them." I pushed the top sheet into his trembling hand. "Marcus Thorne." He stared at the page, his breath catching in his throat. His eyes, when they finally met mine, were wide with a mixture of fear and sudden horror. This is impossible, a fabrication. Someone's trying to frame me." "Frame I with my own digital signature?" I scoffed. "The timestamps align perfectly with the hours leading up to Julian's death. He found out, didn't he? He confronted I about selling off his life's work, the future of VanceTech, to a competitor." Thorne crumpled the paper in his hand. His bravado was a thin veneer already cracking. "No, I don't understand. Julian, he trusted me. I would never. He trusted I with everything," I interrupted, my voice rising slightly. "And I betrayed him for what, Thorne? Money? Revenge? A bigger title at a rival firm?" He sprang to his feet, his chair scraping loudly across the floorboards. "It wasn't like that. I was undervalued, user RF. Julian was a genius, but he was blind. Blind to the market, blind to the opportunities. Viridian was worth billions. I was just his glorified assistant, watching others get rich off my work." His voice cracked, desperation clawing at the edges. "I just wanted what I deserved. And when Julian found out," I pressed, stepping into his space. "When he found the evidence of my theft, what happened then?" His eyes darted around the dusty attic, searching for an escape that wasn't there. He called me to the penthouse. He was furious, not just angry, user RF, but broken asterisk. He said I'd destroyed everything. He threatened to expose me, to ruin me, to send me to prison. A shudder ran through him. I couldn't let that happen. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd planned. He swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a whisper, filled with a chilling blend of regret and self-preservation. We argued. It got heated. He came at me swinging like a madman. I pushed him hard. He stumbled back, hit his head on the railing of the balcony. He was dazed, confused, and I saw my chance. The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, the full, ugly truth. He was groggy, barely conscious, Thorne continued, his eyes glazed over, reliving the moment. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let him expose me. I dragged him to the edge, pushed him over. It was so quick, he didn't even scream. Then I went back inside, wiped down the railing, made it look like he'd jumped. I even typed up that suicide note on his tablet, mimicking his style. I knew his habits, his phrasing. It was easy. Everyone believed it, even Eleanor. He looked at me, a flicker of something close to defiance in his eyes. No one would have ever known if not for you. The attic was silent once more, save for the creaking of the old house. I looked at the man, once Julian Vance's trusted confidant, now a murderer. The truth finally was out. The air in the attic of the ancestral home still felt heavy, thick with the unsaid and the newly revealed. Marcus Thorne stood before me, his shoulders slumped, the facade finally shattered. The dancing dust motes, once so innocuous, now seemed to highlight the grim reality of his confession. I watched him, a man who had built a career on loyalty, now exposed as a serpent. The silence stretched, a brittle thing, until broken by the distant wail of sirens growing steadily louder. I'd made the call the moment Thorne's confession solidified, the evidence already laid bare. 2 uniformed officers entered first, their expressions professional but wary as they took in the scene. The disheveled man, the scattered papers, the palpable tension. They moved with practiced efficiency, their gazes sweeping over the room before settling on Thorne. I briefly explained the situation, pointing to the evidence. I'd uncovered the doctored financial reports, the hidden communication logs, the fabricated alibis that had begun to unravel under my scrutiny. Thorne offered no resistance, no further protests, just a quiet resignation that was almost more chilling than his earlier composure. He held out his wrists, and the cold click of the restraints echoed through the vast, dusty space. As they led him down the narrow attic stairs, his gaze met mine for a fleeting moment. There was no anger, no defiance, just an emptiness that spoke volumes of a soul utterly consumed by its own destructive ambition. I didn't flinch. I had seen that look before many times. It was the face of a man who had finally run out of lies. I stayed behind for a while longer, watching the last of the forensic team pack up their equipment. The attic felt different now. Stripped of its secrets, its ghosts finally laid to rest. Justice, in its own slow, grinding way, had begun to turn its gears. I took a deep breath, the scent of aged wood and settled dust filling my lungs, then descended, leaving the ancestral home to its quiet contemplation. A few days later, the city's hum felt less like background noise and more like a dull ache. Thorne was formally charged, the legal machinery churning into motion. My part in the investigation was done, save for one final, difficult task: debriefing Eleanor Vance. We met in a quiet, unassuming cafe near the financial district, a neutral ground far removed from the opulence of her brother's penthouse or the history of their family home. She sat opposite me, her hands clasped tightly on the polished tabletop, her eyes sharp with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "I have something," she stated, not a question. I nodded, taking a moment to gather my thoughts. There was no easy way to deliver this. "Marcus Thorne," he confessed, "he's been arrested." A small gasp escaped her lips, a fragile sound. "Thorne, but..." He was Julian's right hand, his confidant. "That's what made it so insidious," I explained, leaning forward slightly. Thorne was caught in a deep financial hole, a failed venture he'd been running behind my brother's back. Julian Vance was about to discover it, about to expose him. Thorne knew it would mean ruin, not just professionally, but personally. Julian had a zero-tolerance policy for that kind of deception, especially from someone he trusted. I laid out the timeline, the meticulous details. Thorne confronted Julian in the penthouse. It escalated. Julian was going to pull the plug, maybe even press charges for corporate malfeasance. Thorne panicked. He struck Julian hard, incapacitating him. Then, he staged the scene to look like a suicide. He used the emergency sedative Julian kept for his migraines, injected it, then manipulated the scene to appear as if Julian had done it himself. The note, the angle of the fall, it was all carefully orchestrated to mimic a despairing act. Eleanor listened, her face paling with each word, her shoulders slumping further. The note, Julian's handwriting, a clever forgery practiced over months. Thorne had access to all of Julian's documents, his personal correspondence. He knew Julian's habits, his fears. He even used a specific pen Julian favored, knowing it would lend authenticity. I paused, letting the grim details sink in. It wasn't just about covering up a financial blunder, Eleanor. It was about taking over. Thorne saw an opportunity to step into Julian's shoes, to seize control of VanceTech without Julian's oversight. He even started subtly leaking information about Julian's supposed unstable mental state to key board members, paving the way for his own ascension. Her eyes, usually so keen, were now clouded with pain. He betrayed Julian, and Julian, he trusted him. He did, I confirmed, the word hanging heavy between us. That trust was Thorne's ultimate weapon. She looked away, staring out the window at the bustling street, tears finally tracing paths down her cheeks. The truth, raw and brutal, was finally out, but it offered no comfort, only a different kind of pain. "Thank I, user RF," he finally said, his voice hoarse, "for finding it for Julian." I simply nodded. There wasn't much more to say. The case was closed, the murderer identified, the legal process set in motion. Later, alone in my office, the city lights a distant blur beyond my window. I poured myself a drink. The resolution of a case often felt less like a triumph and more like a quiet defeat. Julian Vance was still dead, his legacy forever tarnished by the shadow of betrayal. Thorne, for all his cunning, was now facing a lifetime behind bars. Was it justice? But the human cost always outweighed the victory. Ambition. It was a potent fuel, capable of building empires, but also of burning them to the ground, taking everything and everyone with them. Julian's ambition had driven him to great heights, but it had also blinded him to the viper in his inner circle. Thorne's ambition had twisted him into a killer, driven by the desperate fear of exposure and the intoxicating lure of power. Eleanor's ambition for truth had led her down a painful path, but at least hers had been driven by a purer motive: love. I traced the rim of my glass. Every case, another lesson. Every revelation, another crack in the veneer of civility. The world kept turning, the city kept humming, and somewhere, another web of deceit was likely already being spun. My job was just to keep pulling at the threads, hoping to untangle the knots before they choked someone else. It was a grim business, but someone had to do it, and for now, that someone was me.